Hello YouTube, I've been doing some research lately, and that's on the trade muskets, and in particular the Native American Indian trade muskets, that I think probably should be considered the most important gun in American history. You hear a lot of historians and everything throwing out the Winchester, the gun that won the West, settled the West, so on and so forth. But you're talking in the 1800s, you're talking things that went on 75 plus years after this country was founded. And the reason I want to go over and I say that these guns were the most influential and important was because of how widespread they were and how they helped start the fur trade. And not a lot of history really is known about these as far as how widespread it is. You see these three books here, these are all excellent books. Every one of these books really does a good job of covering how the Native Americans and how these guns were used, not just by Native Americans, but even your early settlers. You see in Hollywood in the movies, the early settlers all have Kentucky rifles. No, they did not. Even the Kentucky rifle itself was kind of a misnomer. They didn't even call them that until the early 1800s. They really didn't become prevalent until right around the Revolutionary War. French and Indian War, and prior to that, you were more likely to find a smoothbore gun like this, a Fowler of some sort, or a trade gun, than you would a rifle in the hands of someone who lived on the frontier, because they were more useful, which is why the Native Americans preferred them. So the story behind these guns is these guns were, you have to go back and start at probably the early 1600s. And guns were so instrumental to the parts of the Native American. When the French first made contact with the Wendat, the Huron, the Iroquois did not have guns. The Iroquois, in fact, were still using wooden armor. They had wooden armor that they used to protect themselves in combat. While the French, in their first time dealing with the Iroquois, fired on them. Because, hey, they're attacking our allies. And they wiped out 3 Iroquois chiefs with 3 shots. Well, the Iroquois had never seen a gun before. They didn't know what it was. All they knew was they needed them. So they went to the Dutch. And the Dutch said, okay, we will trade with you. We're going to trade for furs. This is what helped start the fur trade even going. Because the French started trading with their allies to the north. And, as modern technology or the technology at the time started going along, you started seeing flintlocks. And the French had their version of the trade musket, which is known fusil de trade, which is literally loosely translated to gun of the trade or trade gun. Fusil de chasse, which is the gun of the hunt. And that's where they traded. They traded their guns. Roughly the same thing, smoothbore guns. 35, 40-inch barrels, sometimes shorter, sometimes longer. Smoothbore guns, 58, 62 caliber, right around there. Pretty much all the same. The French guns seem to have a little different designs to them than the British guns and the Dutch guns. Well, the Dutch didn't really trade and stay in the business very long once the English got into it. And the English immediately said, okay, we're going to start trading for furs with the Iroquois. And the Iroquois immediately said, okay, well, your stuff is better, your guns are better, but there are things that we want. And you'll see a lot of the same things on the Dutch guns and the English guns. And you have to understand how Native Americans viewed their guns was not just as a tool. They viewed them almost spiritually. Because, and that's like you see the one book there, it's called Thundersticks. Well, that's what a lot of different Native American tribes refer to their guns as. And to them, that wasn't just, something that makes a loud noise. One of the things that Native American tribes all over the country revere is the thunderbird. The thunderbird lives in the sky, lives in the clouds, and because Native Americans, when they hear thunder, at that time, when they heard thunder, they didn't know what weather phenomenon was, things like that. To them, it was the thunderbird. And lightning was something that the thunderbird shot out, either out of its eyes, some say the talons, but it was this big, great bird that did this. So to them, when they called these guns thundersticks, it meant they had the power of the Thunderbird. Because they could, like lightning, you could hit and kill something a better distance than a bow and arrow, or with a club. And that meant a lot to them. And that's like, if you flip over these guns, like on the other side, these trade guns, especially the British ones, they'll have the serpent side plate on them. That started with the Dutch guns. And that also was something that the Native Americans, they revered that as what's called in different tribes, basically layman's terms, as the horned underwater serpent. And different tribes had different names for that serpent. The Abenaki called it Petaskog, which loosely translated means great snake. The Iroquois called it, and I'm going to try as best as I can to pronounce this. I have not been able to find a way to actually see how this is pronounced or hear it. Is the Jejodi Quado, which translates to the horned serpent. But everybody seems to have the same basic description, that this serpent had scales and horns of copper. So it even resembled the serpent on the side of the gun. Now, the great horned serpent, the underwater serpent, is the rival or enemy to the Thunderbird. But it's also a symbiotic relationship. The Thunderbird lives above, lives in the sky. The serpent lives underwater, lives below, basically kind of like the underworld. And to some, it was like the Thunderbird. It had power. It had great power. So to them, they're harnessing that power. So that meant a lot to them. And those guns had that serpent on for not only decades, but well over a century. And these guns were made in the thousands. The Hudson Bay Company, the records, because Hudson Bay Company still exists, the records state that in between 1674 and 1781, the Hudson Bay Company bought 46,000 guns from 79 different makers. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot compared to modern firearms, but you can understand, this was before mass production. Every single one of those guns was made by hand. Then you had the guns that the French would trade, because the French didn't have the set trading post early on like the British did. The French had what was called the Courier Dubois. Which translates to runners of the woods. And they were basically independent freelancers that would sell and trade to Native Americans. And they would trade until later on, and then the French had what was called the Northwest Company, and that came into being around 1779. But so who knows how many thousands of guns the French traded with the Wendat and their allies. And then you had other companies later on, like the American Fur Company. So, and then other companies and other independents and other thousands upon thousands and thousands of guns. Okay, and you had this trade going on. Mostly up in the Northeast, the trade was beaver, and of course, as expansion happened, that trade moved farther and farther west. But early on, in 1748, the Hudson Bay Company had a scale set up for how to trade beaver pelts for guns and whatever particular things they wanted. For instance, a gun with a 4-foot barrel, 12 beaver pellets. Gun with a 3.5-foot barrel, 11 beaver pellets. 10 beaver pellets would get you a 3-foot barrel gun. If you wanted 5 pounds of shot, that was 1 beaver pellet. Gunpowder, 1.5 pounds, another beaver pellet. In the Southeast, if you wanted to trade, the trade was for deerskin. The slang term for $1 is a buck. Well, that's because at that time and during the fur trade, a buck skin was a little bigger than that of a doe, and it was worth $1. So that's where the term buck comes from. And that trade was massive. Thousands upon thousands upon thousands of beaver skins and thousands upon thousands of deer skins, and a lot of the trade was through the Native Americans, either trading through letting trapping being done through their lands, on their lands, going through their lands to get to other lands. And a lot of times these companies would finally just hire the Native Americans and go, you know what, why don't we just hire them? And the Native Americans would do some of this trapping and then bring their supplies in, get whatever, trade whatever. And the biggest thing they traded for, guns. That's what they wanted, was guns. And that's what they got. And so it was, these guns were not just made in like a short period of time. There's some of these guns, there's one Hudson Bay Company from 1751. It's got the horns, it's got the serpent on the side of it. It's a flintlock, very just like this, roughly 20 gauge, between 58 and 62 caliber. There's another one from 1822, very similar, gun looks almost the same. Then even there's a Belgian made gun, because the Native Americans told these companies what they wanted. Especially once the French were more or less out of it and trading up in Canada. Once the French were pretty much out of it, the British took over completely the Canadian fur trade, and they were trading up there. But even then, you could still trade in the United States. The federal government didn't tell anyone to stop trading officially with Native Americans until 1866. But there is a Belgian-made trade gun, looks just like the British-made guns, identical to it, almost the same pattern, 1858. It was made for the Northwest Fur Company. The Northwest Fur Company, and again, serpent side plate, flintlock gun, 1858. You're talking 20 years, or at least a good 20 years after your percussion cap system. Native Americans wanted flintlocks. They were easier to use. They were used to them. They just preferred them. One of the oldest is a British-made gun by the Parker Field and Company, 1874. Looks identical to the guns that came before it. It's made for the Hudson Bay Company. It's a flintlock, roughly a 20 gauge. And it's identical to the guns made 100 years before. It's because that's what the Native Americans wanted, and that's what they got. And it's that you had these guns out there, and there are some percussion guns. You'll see them with the side plate on. Some of them were converted. Some of them were made as percussion guns, again mostly by the British. And these guns have the serpent side plate because that's what they wanted. They wanted that same thing. They wanted that. They still had those beliefs. You'll even see, like on some of their hunting bags and stuff like that, you'll see where they had sometimes just the lock plates, the side plates of those guns. You'll see it on their bags and some of their hunting gear, the Thunderbird. It was that revered by them. But this just helped fuel the fur trade that expanded this country west. Right up and the fur trade didn't really start dying out until the early 2000, early like 1900s. The fur trade started to really start dying out right around the Great Depression. The fur trade had run its course. You had some of the fashion industry in New York and Paris and Europe buying a lot of furs. World War I stopped that to a halt and then just shut it down completely, and the fur industry has never gotten back to where it was prior to World War I. But that just tells you how much these guns were in their Native American society and how many of them were made, traded for not just for decades, for centuries. Centuries. That's how important these guns were. And again, Native Americans got the bulk of them, but you did see them in the hands of settlers. You did see them in the hands of people, in the militia. That's what they used. They prefer, they especially people in the frontier, because you could shoot either a round ball or shot at game. It's what the Native Americans preferred. They could take everything with that one gun. The only tribes that really didn't care for these were the Plains tribes because they wanted something they could load quickly on horseback, and these guns were not it. But that's, again, I think these guns are seriously underrated and overlooked for their part in American history. And I do believe, and I firmly believe this, that these trade guns were the most important gun in American history because they launched the fur trade, which helped launch this country and powered industry for decades to help get this country moving. Without the fur trade, this country would have never moved. It would have never gotten going. It was one of the most important industries, and for a long time it was the most important industry. And without the trade to the Native Americans to get these guns in their hands, for them to do allowed trapping, to do trapping themselves, to take pelts, it would have never happened. This country would have never gotten off the ground. And with that being said, YouTube, have a good day.